So a few months ago, I did a video titled, Why Do People Hate DLSS 3 Frame Generation? And the video was mostly well received, but it is also the video with the most dislikes on this channel. The comments were pretty funny, and it made me realize that maybe the point I was trying to get across got lost in translation somewhere. So today we're going back to DLSS 3 frame generation and talk about why you shouldn't hate DLSS 3 frame generation. First up, let's address the differences between DLSS 2 and DLSS 3 and try to clear up some confusion here. DLSS 2 is an upscaler from Nvidia that uses AI for more accurate upscaling. What this means is that if you use DLSS 2 Super Resolution, your game is running at a lower internal resolution determined by the DLSS 2 setting, and then upscale to your monitor's native resolution by leveraging the tensor cores on the GPU. DLSS 3, on the other hand, is just a term. It's a combination of three things, namely DLSS 2, Nvidia Reflex, and frame generation. Nvidia Reflex is some trickery to reduce input latency and improve responsiveness in your games. This is similar to Radeon's anti-lag, though I have no idea how both these technologies work at their core. Nevertheless, frame generation is another AI-based utility that is used to increase frame rates or frames per second by inserting AI-generated frames in between real frames that are generated by the game engine. This uses the upgraded optical flow accelerator found on the RTX 40 series GPUs. This is where the fake frames term comes from and is technically not incorrect. All these three features combined make up DLSS 3. Now, these options can be independently toggled with one exception. You can enable DLSS 2 Super Resolution without Nvidia Reflex. You can have Nvidia Reflex enabled without having frame generation or DLSS 2 Super Resolution enabled, and you can enable frame generation without enabling DLSS 2 Super Resolution, in most games anyway. What you can't do is disable Nvidia Reflex when you enable frame generation. The reason is when you enable frame generation, it does increase your input latency slightly. By how much, you might ask? Well, it depends on your base frame rate before frame generation is enabled. We're going to have a look at that right now. Alright, so this will just be a quick test to show you the difference in PC latency or input latency. I know that this method is maybe not 100% accurate. You need the Nvidia Reflex monitor and tools, etc. But I don't have that, so we'll just be relying on the GeForce Experience performance overlay there in the top right hand corner. Currently we're getting around 50 frames per second. This is at 1440p with the RT Ultra preset, but no DLSS 2 and no frame generation. So let's just see, going from 45 milliseconds, the average PC latency there. I'm just going to enable frame generation here and leave super resolution disabled. And let's see what happens here to the latency. It does take a little while to normalize, and you can see we are sitting at around 55 millisecond latency, right? So that's a big increase in the input latency, although the game definitely still feels 100% fine. This is a single player shooter game. This latency is definitely not the end of the world. But then let's see what happens if we just disable frame generation and we just enable DLSS Super Resolution. Right, and now you can see our average PC latency has decreased from 35 milliseconds to 30 milliseconds. Our frame rate went up from 50 frames per second to 80 frames per second. So that's a pretty good increase in performance all by itself. And now we'll enable frame generation along with these settings as well. Just make sure the DLSS Super Resolution is set to the previous setting, because it does default to auto when you enable frame generation in Cyberpunk. Right, so let's just give it a little while to normalize. And now you can see we're back to 40 millisecond latency, right? So sure, it's more or less the same as what it was at 50 frames per second, slightly lower, but the motion fluidity of what is presented to me is much improved. And seeing that it's a single player game, the slight increase in input latency is definitely not going to bother me. That said, Linus also did a few blind tests, and most of his staff couldn't actually tell the difference between frame generation on versus off. So if you do need a monitor or a tool to show you that there's an increase in input latency and you can't notice it by yourself, then that just speaks volumes, right? It's the same as going from 110 to 120 frames per second. You won't be able to see or tell the difference unless you've got a frame rate counter. All right, but let's have a look at another game quickly. All right, so here we have Spider-Man Remastered. I just want to show you the settings quickly. So we're at 1440p once again, frame generation disabled, upscaling disabled, and everything is set to very high. We've got the highest settings for ray tracing enabled here as well. And here you can see our average PC latency is around 30 milliseconds. And we're getting around 87 frames per second, right? So I'm just going to enable DLSS super resolution quickly and see what we can get. So this game is actually very nice because it supports multiple methods of upscaling, but we'll stick to DLSS super resolution because that's what we used in our previous test. And remember, we had around 80 frames per second, 85 and 30 milliseconds input latency, right? Let's just apply the changes here. And now you can see that our frame rate actually did not increase. Now, if we just open up our MSI Afterburner overlay here, you can see that the RTX 4080 usage is sitting at around 60%. Now, this is because the game at this point is CPU bound. This is a 12700K CPU, so no slouch, but definitely an issue for the RTX 4080 in this game at these settings. Now we can change the DLSS settings as much as we want, and we won't see any improvement in performance. We can even go to ultra performance. We might see a slight change in performance, but not a lot. Let's just go back there, and still sitting with 87 frames per second, right? So that's just a perfect example of a CPU bottleneck, and the game doesn't look that good. All right, let's just move that back over to quality quickly, and I'll just show you another benefit of frame generation. Right, so back at DLSS quality, still 85 frames per second, 30 millisecond latency, and nothing that we do actually improved our frame rate, right? So let's just enable frame generation here. You'll see that the VSync now gets grayed out. All right, so let's just apply this here quickly. And now we're getting 160 frames per second. So pretty much double what we had. The PC latency went up slightly by 10 milliseconds. Once again, that's a 33% increase, but 10 milliseconds is 100th of a second, right? So I highly doubt that you're going to be noticing that. And you can see that with frame generation, our frame rate now improved to, well, you can see it's 160 frames per second basically, and the motion fluidity is much improved as well. So that's just another benefit of frame generation. When you are CPU bound, you can still get decent frame rate improvements. All right, then on to our last game. All right, so the last game we're going to have a look at is Ratchet and Clank. It's actually developed by the same developers as Spider-Man Remastered, Insomniac, and it was ported by Nix's last week or thereabouts. It's actually a pretty good game. It's got its issues. It's crashing quite a bit for me. Anyway, let's just go over the settings here quickly. So still at 1440p, no DLSS, no upscaling, and we've got ray tracing enabled everywhere as well, and we're sitting at around 78 frames per second with around 35 milliseconds of PC latency. So let's just enable frame generation here quickly. All right, so we can just go ahead and apply that, and immediately we went from 80 frames per second to 130 frames per second. Our average PC latency once again increased by around 10 to 12 milliseconds. Definitely not the end of the world, but now we have a high refresh rate experience, right? Going from 80 frames per second to 130 frames per second, depending on where you look, obviously. Let's just see what happens when we only enable a DLSS super resolution. So I'm just going to disable frame generation here and just use a DLSS super resolution here on quality mode. All right, and our average PC latency stays more or less the same as what it was at native. Our frame rate did increase by around 25-30%, which is good to see. So just keep that in mind, 25 milliseconds, let's call it 30 milliseconds, and let's then enable frame generation as well. All right, so just give it some time to settle down, and we went from 80 frames per second, give or take, to 160 frames per second with around 10 to 12 milliseconds increase in PC latency. Now, I think that's extremely good. The game still feels very good. And if you do play it with the controller like I do, I'm benchmarking here with the keyboard and mouse, but if you do play with the controller, you definitely won't feel that 10 millisecond increase in latency. And even playing keyboard and mouse, if you do feel that, like, you have to be extremely sensitive to it. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that if you have a high enough frame rate, I'd say 50, 60 frames per second, and you start enabling a frame generation, the input latency is definitely not an issue. And it's just to give some players like myself a high refresh rate experience with ray tracing, etc. enabled, right? It's not there to give you an end result of 60 frames per second. Your starting point should be around 60 frames per second. Otherwise, the input latency will definitely become an issue. I actually do have a Cyberpunk video up where I tested the 4070 Ti, and I went from 30 frames per second to 50 frames per second, and the input latency was around 200 milliseconds, and that you can definitely feel. All right, but back to my script. Now we'll talk about when you should be using frame generation. This is not a magical fix that will suddenly turn your 4060 into a beast 4K GPU. Sure, you can probably go from 20 frames per second to 40 frames per second by using frame generation, but the input latency will be horrendous and the game will basically be unplayable. I personally have found that as long as I have around 50 frames per second as a base frame rate, I can enable frame generation without the increased input latency be an issue. Sure, there are people that are a lot more sensitive to input latency, and you should probably avoid this tech if high input latency bothers you. The real benefit of frame generation comes in the form of high refresh rate gaming. In Cyberpunk 2077, for example, at 1440p with the RT Ultra preset and DLSS set to quality, I'm getting around 90 frames per second. When I enable frame generation, that now becomes around 120 to 130 frames per second. Well, it actually goes to around 160 frames per second when I'm not recording on this machine using OBS. Now, this is not just a number on a benchmark that is increasing. The motion fluidity the user is experiencing is much improved. It does indeed look like 160 frames per second because the monitor is displaying 160 frames per second. Whether 33% of the frames are AI generated, it doesn't matter because I'm still presented with an output of 160 frames per second. This is perfect for me because my monitor is a 165 Hz G-Sync monitor, and now I get full use out of it at the highest possible settings in one of the most demanding games currently available on PC. Now, you will see that the input latency is slightly higher than it was when we were getting around 100 frames per second, but it is still low enough not to bother me personally. That said, normally when your frame rate goes up, your input latency goes down. With frame generation, the opposite happens. So it might not feel like 160 frames per second based on the input responsiveness. Once again, if you are at all sensitive to additional input latency and it bothers you, this tech is definitely not for you. Maybe we will see the input latency penalty be reduced in future, but at the moment, unfortunately, it is what it is. Next up, we'll talk a bit about power consumption. The whole ADA generation is very efficient when it comes to watt per frame, but that might not mean much to most people. Frame generation can further reduce the GPU's power usage by quite a bit. I can, for example, run Diablo 4 at 1440p Ultra with DLSS 3 enabled at 90 frames per second while the GPUs are using around 100 watts. I personally use this when I'm running off of batteries, as in South Africa we have rolling blackouts daily, sometimes even up to 12 hours a day. This reduces my system's overall power consumption and allows me to be able to game while experiencing these blackouts. Sure, the input latency isn't great when using these settings, but Diablo 4 is not a latency sensitive game, and it is definitely better to at least be able to play than, say, not play. Next up, we'll talk about which games you should use it in. Well, I see many comments that say not to use it in competitive multiplayer shooters, and the good news here is that there aren't any competitive multiplayer shooters that support frame generation, well, as far as I know anyway. Even if they were, you shouldn't be using this. It is perfectly fine in all single player games and even some multiplayer games as well. Multiplayer games that support DLSS 3 include games like F1 22 and 23, Diablo 4 for example, and there is no issue whatsoever in these games if you enable frame generation. These games do run at high frame rates anyway, so what is the benefit of enabling frame generation? Well, I'm glad you asked. In Diablo 4, while it doesn't really increase the frame rate as much as in other games, it does help in reducing stuttering. In the F1 games, it helps a lot once you start enabling ray tracing, and since a few milliseconds additional input latency is not going to make a difference in either of these games, they are perfect candidates for this technology. Now, you might be saying, if you need a high frame rate for frame generation to be viable, what is the whole point? You don't need more than 60 frames per second in AAA titles. Well, we are already discussed this, and it is not to give you a playable 60 frames per second. It is there to give you a high refresh rate experience. Competitive players sure aren't the only gamers that enjoy a higher frame rate and a higher refresh rate. Sure, you don't need more than 60 frames per second, but then what is the point of buying a high refresh rate monitor if you aren't going to be making full use of it anyway? Many enthusiasts, myself included, prefer a high refresh rate gaming experience, whether it's AAA single player titles or a competitive online shooter, whatever the case, and that is who DLSS 3 frame generation is actually for. Lastly, we'll talk about the price premium. The current generation of GPUs is expensive, very expensive, and a lot of people put the blame on DLSS 3. One of the complaints I see the most is that the raw power of GPUs haven't increased. Instead, Nvidia is bumping up prices and relying on DLSS and frame generation to sell cards. And while there is some merit to that, I don't agree entirely. Let me explain. The 4090 is the most powerful GPU we have ever seen, and by a long shot. When compared to the previous generation, it is on average around 50% faster than the 3090 Ti. The 4080 is also a massive increase in performance and is on average around 50% faster than the previous gen 3080. The 4070 Ti is about as fast as a 3090 Ti at 1440p and around 42% faster than a 3070 Ti from last gen. These are impressive gains and definitely shows that raw power has indeed increased quite a lot at the top end. Now, these cards aren't cheap, and along with a nice performance bump, we also got a not so nice bump in the price. But the point here is that raw power of these GPUs have increased substantially, and these GPUs don't need to rely on frame generation to definitively beat their previous generation counterparts. While the 4070 is still a decent GPU, being about 22% faster than the 3070, the 4060 and 4060 Ti have proven all naysayers correct. Both these cards sometimes lose to the previous generation counterparts, with the 4060 also having less VRAM than the 3060. Now, I know there are two 3060s, a 12GB and an 8GB version, but we all know there's only one version, and that's the 12GB version. When running at higher resolutions or detail settings, the 4060 oftentimes matches the performance of the 3060 and sometimes even loses to the 3060. This is completely unacceptable. So in this case, I agree that Nvidia is relying purely on DLSS 3 to sell these cards. That said, you can still use DLSS 3 on the 4060 and 4060 Ti to turn your 1080p 60 frames per second experience into a 1080p high refresh rate experience in games that support DLSS 3. It should, however, not be the only selling point of these GPUs, and unfortunately, it kinda is at this point. And therefore, I would highly suggest not to consider the 4060 or 4060 Ti, especially at these current prices. We all know that the 4060 is supposed to be a 4050 or 4050 Ti at best, and the 4060 Ti should at best be a normal 4060. You will be much better off buying previous generation AMD or Nvidia GPUs at this point, even if it means that you are missing out on frame generation.